And the goal of this meeting is for anybody who wants to make either spoken or written comments challenging the Copperwood wastewater discharge permit application to have some confidence in what they're doing. So we're going to share today as much as we can to give you a broad introduction to this topic. And we have the honor of being joined by Bill Dam, who is with us. Bill is a 40-year professional geoscientist who has worked with the Department of Energy, U.S. Geological Survey, and more. And Bill, you are invited to chime in at any moment throughout this presentation. We're also going to go into Bill's analysis towards the end, and you can find Bill's full analysis of this permit at protecttheporkies.com if you click Take Action. So some important dates. In just 2 days from now, that is the public hearing with Michigan's regulators, where we will have 3 minutes to make spoken comments. And you can register if you have not already at protecttheporkies.com. Thursday, July 16th is the last day to submit written comments. It's actually July 17th at 7 o'clock in the morning, but I don't think most folks are going to be writing comments early morning. So just think July 16th is the last day. And you can find links for all of this, protecttheporkies.com. Go down to action number 2. All right, so we're going to give just a summary of what you're going to be hearing, just so we have kind of a thesis statement. So this is the overview. An inexperienced, highly opposed foreign company should not be permitted to dump any wastewater into a Michigan stream when feasible alternatives like zero liquid discharge have not been considered. The documented presence of a state endangered fish, the red-side dace, makes the proposal especially atrocious. The last survey of red-side dace was in 2010. Since then, fish may have migrated and established new populations. The permit must be denied until a new survey has been conducted. In the context of other permitted activities, which have already resulted in real-world destruction for the sake of a speculative, unfunded project, this may be the last chance for Michigan's environmental regulators to prove they are not corporate servants, but public servants. And we're going to go in more in depth into what all of this means. But the moral of the story is they should deny the permit. So this is Michigan's regulatory agency, EGLE. These are the folks we're trying to convince to deny that permit. The permit, we call it a wastewater discharge permit, but the full name is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. And that word elimination is key because, as Bill educated us on, the NIPD's permitting started in response to a time when the natural waterways of the country were basically being used as unregulated dumping grounds, to the point that rivers like this one were catching on fire. So this is the Cuyahoga River that caught on fire in 1969, and just a few years later, NIPD's permitting started. But now, in this case and in many others, NIPD's is being used not to eliminate pollution from existing sources, but to introduce pollution into pristine areas like the Porcupine Mountains or the close proximity of the Porcupine Mountains. In which case, we think it would be more appropriate to rename it the National Pollutant Discharge Creation System, because it is entirely antithetical to the original purpose of the permit. So this is the map that is included. This yellow triangle is where they would be discharging most of the contaminated wastewater. This brown triangle would come from their sewage lagoon. That's another discharge site. And this dark green, because they don't show it on the map itself, this is actually the state park. So you see the proximity of Porcupine Mountain State Park. That's where the wastewater would flow. And this juncture of Namabinog Creek and the tributary to Namabinog Creek is an important point. That's where red-side dace have been documented, which is a state endangered fish. Another point here, this purple point is where last year Michigan's regulators approved a plan for a mine exhaust tower. You see how close it is to the state park. It's about 100 feet. And also, there's a tailings disposal facility that's been proposed, which would hold over 40 million tons of waste, again, in extreme proximity to the state park. So before continuing, let's take a look at some images of the area. These images come from a study that was done in 2010. So the points labeled N1, N2, N3, and N4 would all be in the path of discharge water. And this is what this stream looks like. So it's a very humble stream, but certainly large enough to be home to a great many life forms. It does reach Lake Superior year-round, according to the study, even if it's a small trickle. But what's being proposed, you see here, is 0.5 million gallons daily. So a 500,000 gallons daily of treated, processed wastewater, tailings basin wastewater, and mine dewatering water, and an unspecified amount of stormwater. And among the constituents in that wastewater would be everything you see on this chart, cadmium, chromium, lead, selenium, mercury. They certainly filter out a fair amount of it, but a certain amount is permitted as well. And it looks like we've got, I'm going to go ahead and mute folks just so everyone's muted. Great. Okay. So the second proposed discharge site would be 4 million gallons, 4.2 million gallons per year from the sanitary wastewater of the sewage lagoon. There are also chemicals that are used during froth flotation. So the way that the copper is separated is when all of the rock is pulverized, the copper is separated using flotation agents. And the water treatment for these flotation agents has not yet been finalized. So we're being asked to support a permit when the plan for treating the water has not yet even been released. And many of these compounds used for flotation are highly toxic to aquatic organisms. So here you see the safety data sheets for 4 of these compounds. Methyl isobutyl carbonyl, harmful to aquatic life. Sodium xanthate, toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Sodium hydrosulfide, very toxic to aquatic life. Indodecyl mercaptan, very toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Yeah, this warning label is not ideal. Of course, many of these compounds, they do break down, some faster than others, but the permit currently reveals no plan for exactly how they are filtered. So this is one reason among many for why this permit should be denied until it's been made clear to the public that none of these aquatic toxins will be released. So the company, of course, will be treating and filtering the water to remove a fair amount of toxicity. And one of the methods that they use is reverse osmosis and ion exchange. But that has other disadvantages because, as you see from this study from the World Health Organization, when water is stripped of all of its minerals, it becomes highly aggressive. So it's kind of like if you haven't eaten a meal in a month, you're going to eat whatever is put on your plate in front of you. That's how this water is. When it's stripped of all of its minerals, it becomes highly aggressive and it absorbs new minerals. This study was for demineralized water in relation to human consumption. So they talk about how demineralized water aggressively leaches metals from lead pipes and then makes them transmittable to humans. They also strip minerals from the human body when consumed. So if demineralized water has all of these effects on humans, what effect could it have on a stream? And indeed, one of the permit documents mentions the corrosive properties due to the absence of ions in this deionized water. And no clear plans have been shown to the public for exactly how this will be mitigated. So another point is the total dissolved solids, according to the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. The permit allows for up to 2 to 3 times higher total dissolved solids than the natural levels of the creek. And they framed it in terms of milligrams. Bill came in, and in order to make this more comprehensible to folks, he converted milligrams to pounds. And so the total dissolved solids would be up to about 768,000 pounds per year of total dissolved solids released into the creek. And to make that more comprehensible, that is the equivalent of 153 Ford F-150 trucks crashing and dissolving into the stream every single year for up to 10 years. And many of those constituents would include trace amounts of mercury, cadmium, lead, etc. And Bill, if you want to chime in at any moment to elaborate on any of this, please feel free.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I love the visualization of that.
Yeah,
I
let's go
think
back
it's
to it.
I think what's important is for people to realize we're talking about total dissolved solids. So that's all the major cations and anions, things like sodium and potassium, calcium, um, the chloride, and all the different salts and things. But we're also talking, as Tom mentioned, about all the heavy metals. It can be quite a few things. But what's important to know is that when you have so much discharge of dissolved solids, like he says, 500,000 gallons per day, those dissolved solids don't necessarily stay in a liquid form. In fact, we all know what happens when salt gets evaporated. When water with salt water gets evaporated, it'll leave the salt behind. And one of the concerns I have is that the stream banks will be filled with with contaminants. They'll dry out. They will be absorbed by the sediments. They so the liquid might be removed, but the a lot of this dissolved solids will be left behind.
Thank you, Bill. So I'm going to show these images of the stream a few times in this presentation, just so we remember that we're talking about a real place with real life forms that will be impacted. So Highland Copper released a public statement about a month ago. And in that statement, they said the stream receiving water discharge was specifically selected as it has no red side dace or other aquatic species populations. So let that sink in for a moment. No aquatic species populations in that image that you're looking at right now. Somebody at Highland Copper thought that was a good idea to put that out there. And we're going to address this statement because we have evidence to the contrary, not just common sense, but we also have evidence. This was a study from 2010. Again, that yellow triangle is the discharge site. So those two light blue circles are directly downstream from the discharge site, and 50 fish were collected, including all of these species. And indeed, there was one red-side dace that was collected, which is a state endangered fish, legally protected. So this is the range. We're going to talk a bit about the red side dace, but of course, we would be opposing this permit with or without the red side dace because discharging all of that wastewater will affect many, many different life forms. But this is the distribution of the red side dace. And you can see that our area, the proposed wastewater site, is not even listed because it is the newest and the northernmost area where red side dace have been documented. I found this article, which came out just a few days ago. There's a highway proposal in Ontario that is being resisted also because it impacts the habitat of red side dace. And there was some great text that was here. So the red side dace is the only minnow. Oops. The red-side dace is the only minnow that can leap out of the water to catch flying insects. In doing so, it plays a small but vital ecological role, linking land and water ecosystems by feeding on terrestrial insects like flies and mosquito, helping naturally manage localized pest populations, and transferring that energy into the aquatic food web. As part of the food chain across watersheds, this unique fish also acts as prey for larger fish and birds. Its survival functions as a living indicator of stream health, as it cannot survive in warm, polluted, or heavily disturbed waters, making its presence a signal of intact, high-quality habitat, and its disappearance an early warning of the ecosystem's decline long before other species are affected. So the red-side dace is a sensitive fish and therefore an indicator species of the overall health of the ecosystem. And here we have a study specifically on the populations of red-side dace in the Copperwood mine site. That orange star is the discharge site. And you see that they found red-side dace directly downstream in Namabinog Creek near the mouth at Lake Superior, as well as several others in the parallel creek to the discharge site, Namabinog Creek. So when we see the statement, the stream receiving water discharge was selected as it has no red-side dace or other aquatic species populations, it makes you wonder if they've seen their own studies that were commissioned for the mine proposal. And this should be really raising all of our red flags that a company which is willing to make this statement seriously, we're being asked to entrust them with their first ever mine right next to the largest northern old growth forest east of the Mississippi River. And in fact, their own feasibility report from 2018 recognizes that there is a red-side dace. It says the treated wastewater may have fewer constituents like sediment and dissolved minerals than the natural surface water. So they recognize that. This water will have over 1 mile of stream valley and beaver ponds to obtain sediment, dissolved minerals, and dissolved oxygen before entering the main branch where the red-side dace have been found. So they recognize it's going to be unnatural water, but they're going to let the beavers take care of it. And the treated water will have, air quotes, natural characteristics by the time it enters the main branch of the creek. And we would encourage everyone to use mocking air quotes when you say natural, because it's not at all going to be the same quality as the wastewater, as Bill's analysis shows. Another interesting point is that all of this information on species of concern, which was in their 2018 report, is totally absent from their updated 2023 feasibility report. So fortunately, we have the old copy. So we've heard the question raised, was the red-side dace introduced in this area? Firstly, it doesn't matter because the Endangered Species Act doesn't distinguish, but the study that was done on this topic concluded that an introduction within the Copperwood site is unlikely. It's a very remote area. It just doesn't make any sense. It's simply that they hadn't been documented. More information on the red-side dace is that they are shown to use a sequence of pools as their primary habitat, and the species occupies shallow systems where ice may be a dominant feature during winter. The species is especially sensitive to stream alterations that interfere with flow regimes and lead to increased siltation and water temperatures. So this stream, which is, quite humble and shallow and creates a plethora of pools, is the ideal habitat for the red-side dace. If its flow is vastly increased with up to 500,000 gallons of wastewater per day, it very likely will no longer be an ideal habitat because it will change the water temperature and it will change the depth of the system. So so far, the only media outlet to report on this story is Michigan Advance. And in that story, Jay Roberts, an environmental scientist for Highland Copper, said an endangered fish study was undertaken and they intended to follow the recommendations. When Michigan Advance asked for a copy of the study, neither the mining company nor the regulators were able to provide it, but we have it here. And what the study actually says is that the newly discovered populations may be particularly vulnerable due to the small size of the watershed and sensitivity to impact. and that populations of red-side dace within the mine site should be protected from human-related impacts, especially those that could alter hydrology, water temperature, or turbidity should be avoided or minimized to the extent possible. So it kind of sounds like they didn't read the study. Um, Scott Dean from AGLE, Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, also made the statement that the proposed discharge is not expected to impact the red-side dace as the fish's observed range is upstream from where the West Branch and the main creek meet. However, we can see here that there very clearly was a documented red-side dace directly downstream. And this is the only survey on public record. So one of the things we're calling for is for a new survey to be conducted before the permit can be considered so that we know exactly where the red-side dace are located because fish do move over time, contrary to popular belief. But even if there was no red-side dace here, um, Steve Garsky made a great point that what happens downstream can actually impact and will impact what happens upstream. You know, water flows downstream, but life forms like the stonefly and the mayfly migrate upstream as adults where they become food sources for other life forms like the red-side dace. So any reduction of insect population down here will reduce the biomass, which can then migrate upstream to become a food source, and that will then impact any fish that would be upstream. So we're going to focus just a bit here on environment, Great Lakes, and energy because this new proposal needs to be seen in the context of their other permitted activities. Eagle, I know a lot of folks pronounce them eagle. I simply don't want to conflate them with a glorious bird, which doesn't approve contamination and destruction of habitat. So Eagle previously has approved a mine exhaust vent 150 feet from the state park. And they have also approved the destruction of 61 acres of wetlands in order to make room for that 323 acre waste facility. What you see here is actually where the company has created new wetlands. They don't look wet yet, but the water will come in eventually. Eagle also permitted the company to reroute streams, which were flowing inconsiderately where they need to store all of their waste. So this is the stream reroute from 2024. They rerouted 6 streams. And this was all of the destruction of wetlands, the destruction of the streams was permitted even though the company lacks over $400 million. They don't have the power grid or the cell towers or any of the infrastructure they need. And now we're being asked to approve a permit to discharge 500,000 gallons of wastewater per day into a Humble stream where state endangered fish has been documented. So we really, in our comments, we want to hold the regulators' feet to the fire and let them know that we're on, their last straw. This is a highly opposed project. Again, the red-side dace is symbolic here because, of course, we want a sensitive life form to be protected, but it's also the totality of all life in this system. Bill makes the really great point, as he mentioned, that as creek levels rise and fall with weather events, seasons, and variable mining discharge quantities, water stored in the banks and evaporated water containing toxic heavy metals and stream sediments are washed onto land and can become airborne and dispersed into the streams and forest. Bioaccumulation then occurs through the food chain, impacting wildlife. So the stream level changes and any toxins can be swept onto land.
And something else to add there, Tom, is that we've done studies that trees and plants that take water up also take salts and they take these contaminants and they put them into the soil. And so what's really important here is that it's not just discharged only into the creek, but it's going to affect the entire environment. It's going to affect the ecosystem. It's going to affect the biodiversity and bioaccumulation. And there's so many processes that scientists know about to say this is wrong. And I wanted to mention one other thing about the NPDES permit is that that permit shows what they're required to sample for, and it has nothing. There's a lot of things that are missing. They don't ask for, you know, or basically, this is the mining company asking to do the permit for the state permission, and they're not offering to do even a simple test for hardness, which is calcium and magnesium, which you need to know, like as Tom was saying about reverse osmosis water. So this permit really needs to be denied.
Thank you, Bill. And to follow up on your point about greater impacts to the ecosystem, one of the main concerns is what is called a trophic cascade. So they're looking at harms to a couple fish and fleas as examples of what the impacts would be to the whole system. But what about impacts to the smallest scale of life? Microbes, fungi, plankton, which then affects higher scales and higher. So small changes can then avalanche into much larger ones that were not predicted. And a couple ways that this happens is through bioaccumulation. This is when toxins, like certain forms of mercury, build up within a single species over time. And then biomagnification is when those toxins build up because they move higher and higher up the food chain. The big fish eat the little ones, the bear eats the big fish, and the toxic levels get higher and higher. None of this is considered when we have these very short-sighted proposals. But instead of all of that, Bill brought to our attention something called zero liquid discharge. Again, the goal of Protect the Porkies is to make sure that the Copperwood mine does not move forward. However, throughout the course of our activities in resisting this mine, we've already seen the company put forth better proposals so that if the project does move forward, it will be a best case scenario rather than a worst case scenario. And one very valid way of challenging the permit is by suggesting feasible alternatives. And so Bill says, given the skyrocketing commodity prices of copper and silver, we urge the regulators to require Copperwood to be a zero discharge facility by using the water treatment plant to concentrate and remove all liquid contaminants, including the reverse osmosis water. Instead of accepting the current proposal, we advocate rejecting the NIPD's permit to require zero liquid discharge. And we're going to talk about this possibility a bit more. But Bill makes the point that the company, they should have plenty of money because copper is now at an all-time high. And here we have the CEO on X is bragging about how as copper has moved from $4 to $5 to $6 a pound, the net asset value of the project has tripled and then, almost doubled again. So gone from 170 million to $850 million. If they're making all that extra money, Michigan and its ecosystems should benefit from superior technologies being employed. So zero liquid discharge essentially evaporates all of the wastewater and crystallizes the remaining toxic solids, which can then be transported off-site, and therefore nothing needs to be released into the stream. It is more expensive. It is more energy intensive. It's not a perfect solution. The only perfect solution is not to create pollution in the first place. But that seems to be a very superior option than contaminating a pristine area right next to a beloved old growth forest. This is what is currently being proposed. Zero liquid discharge would make all of this unnecessary. So you can consider advocating for this or not, or even just suggesting it as evidence that not all feasible alternatives have been considered. So Bill's full analysis can be found at protecttheporkies.com/take action. But here are a few other points that he makes, which may or may not be directly related to the permit, but were quite interesting. So, on the topic of power, he says expanded electrical grid transmission and on-site power requirements will be significant to operate systems like reverse osmosis and would necessitate additional capacity from baseload power by burning coal, natural gas turbines, or potentially nuclear. So, we don't often think about all the power that is required to operate, a 500,000 gallons of wastewater being produced per day. In terms of heavy metals, the discharge of heavy metals into the creek possesses numerous detrimental impacts. The presence of significant iron sulfide minerals when exposed to oxygen can create sulfuric acid and result in acid mine drainage. The company claims that Copperwood has minimal potential for acid mine drainage. However, Bill actually spoke to the author of that study, and he came away with a different conclusion, which we can go more into depth in the discussion that'll follow this presentation. Um, Dissolved metals forming soluble complexes can pose a long-term threat through sorption. Bill, can you explain what that sentence means? What is sorption and soluble complexes?
Yeah, just think of it in terms of like a sponge. And so if the rock is a sponge, and you can also have some of these minerals dissolved in the water, and they sorb, or they attach heavy metals with them. Um, and so people know about these processes in nature, that there's been a lot of work done at typical mine sites, contamination sites, and things just don't go away. Um, they'll remain behind, and so um, we have to look at it from the standpoint of, they're proposing already to do reverse osmosis. They, the mining company wants to concentrate the copper and the silver, and when they send that concentrate to the refinery, if there's any impurities, which would include like arsenic and things like that, have to get paid or charged more. It costs them more to, so they're trying to separate out the stuff that's economical and that'll make them money, and take out and dump the stuff into the environment, the stuff that they don't want, that would cost them money. But they can, using like zero discharge, they can use evaporation. As mechanical evaporation is what we're talking about, where they use machines, and they're commonly used in a lot of different industrial processes to do mechanical evaporation. Then, as Tom says, those pollutants will be dried out and then sent to a hazardous waste facility. So there's one statement you could make, is that there's no reason to turn this area into a toxic waste dump.
Exactly. Thank you, Bill. So, one other really compelling point that Bill makes in the analysis, and I would encourage folks to go and read the full analysis, which is linked on the website, is not related to this permit directly, but the erosion of the area. The cliff bank of Lake Superior has been recorded eroding towards the mine site at a rate of 1.6 feet per year. And the company is proposing to mine up to 100 feet from Lake Superior. So within about 62 years, the lakeshore could reach the proximity of the proposed underground mine site. That's a ballpark figure. It could be faster or much slower, depending on weather events. But this is something that has not been discussed for one of the dangers of this project. What happens when the lakeshore reaches the mining chamber?
And that was in there. That was in the Highland Copper feasibility study. I mean, that I just got that from their own study. That it's not been verified. I think there's probably um, a lot more information and research, and contacting university professors or people in the area who are doing Lake Superior studies would be helpful. But that's just repeating to them. A lot of everything we're showing is just the stuff that they're telling us.
Exactly. So, to repeat our starting summary, an inexperienced, highly opposed foreign mining company should not be permitted to dump any wastewater into a Michigan stream when feasible alternatives like zero liquid discharge have not yet been considered. As Bill said, we already have toxic waste treatment facilities. We do not need to turn Lake Superior into one. We don't need to turn the creek into a toxic waste dump. The documented presence of a state endangered fish makes the proposal especially atrocious. The last survey of the red side dace was in 2010, so the permit should be denied until a new survey has been conducted. And in the context of other permitted activities, which have already resulted in the destruction of wetlands and streams for the sake of a speculative, unfunded project, this may be the last chance for Michigan's environmental regulators to prove they are not corporate servants, but public servants. Deny the permit. We would encourage everybody, no matter your level of expertise, to not just submit a written comment, but to sign up for that hearing on Wednesday, because that 3 minute spoken comment is really a time when we can transmit some emotion and bring some fire. There's a lot you can communicate technically in written comments, and it used to be that people met in person. So right now, being able to give spoken comments is our best opportunity to connect on a more human level. July 16th, the last day to submit written comments. More info at protecttheporkies.com. Click take action. And with that, we will open to any questions and discussion.